In 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army established a covert research facility in Manchuria, in occupied China. It was called Unit 731. It was not a prison, it was not a battlefield, it was a laboratory. Human beings were brought there specifically to be used as test subjects. Prisoners, Chinese, Korean, Russian and others, were held in cells on the compound. They were referred to internally as maruta, a Japanese word meaning logs. They were not given names. Researchers infected them with plague, cholera, and typhoid. They observed the progression of disease without administering treatment. Subjects were subjected to frostbite experiments, pressure chamber tests, vivisection, and live dissection, often without anesthesia. The facility operated for 8 years. Estimates of the death toll ranged from 3,000 to over 10,000. When the war ended, the program's directors were granted immunity by the United States in exchange for their research data. This actually happened documents history's worst chapters, the well-known and the forgotten. Manchuria, 1932. Japan had just seized the region from China, renamed it Manchukuo, and installed a puppet government. It was, on paper, a new state. In practice, it was a laboratory. The man assigned to run that laboratory was Shiro Ishii. He was a physician, a graduate of Kyoto Imperial University, a man who had traveled Europe in the late 1920s studying how Western powers were developing biological weapons programs while publicly signing the 1925 Geneva Protocol banning them. He came home with a conclusion that was simple and, in his mind, logical. Every major military power was pursuing this. Japan could not afford to fall behind. And if the treaty prohibited the use of biological weapons, it said nothing, technically, about research. That reasoning, that the prohibition on use created a window for development, was not unique to Ishii. It was the kind of thinking that emerges when states treat international law as a negotiating position rather than a constraint. What was unique was how far Ishii was permitted to take it. He found willing ears. The Imperial Japanese Army funded his proposals through the 1930s, and by 1936 he had consolidated his operations into a sprawling complex outside the city of Harbin in occupied Manchuria. The complex was officially designated the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. It would become known by the number assigned to it in military bureaucracy as Unit 731. The site itself was enormous. Covering roughly 6 square kilometers, it included laboratories, housing blocks, administrative buildings, an airstrip, a crematorium. At its peak, somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Japanese personnel worked there. Scientists, physicians, technicians, military guards. This was not a secret dungeon run by a few rogue officers. It was an institution. It had a budget, a chain of command, a research agenda that was reviewed and approved at the highest levels of the Japanese military establishment. Understanding how something like this becomes possible requires understanding what Manchuria was, politically and psychologically, to the Japanese state. It was not Japan. That distinction mattered enormously. The racial ideology that structured Japanese imperial thinking in this period drew a hard line between the Japanese home islands and the occupied territories. Manchuria was populated by what the ideology classified as inferior peoples: Chinese, Korean, Russian, Mongolian. This dehumanization was not incidental to what happened at Unit 731. It was the precondition. The prisoners brought to the facility were referred to in internal documents not as patients, not even as prisoners. They were called maruta. The word means logs. It was the cover story. If anyone asked what the facility was transporting, the answer was lumber. The logs were people. The language was not accidental. Language that removes humanity makes what follows easier to administer, easier to document, and easier to continue. Most of the prisoners were Chinese civilians and soldiers, though the records also show Koreans, Mongolians, Russians, and a smaller number of Allied prisoners of war. They were delivered through a network that involved the Kempeitai, Japan's military police, who arrested people on charges that were often fabricated or never specified at all. Suspected partisans, criminals, people who were simply available. The transfers were handled through paperwork that described the deliveries in the same bureaucratic language used to requisition supplies. Once inside the facility, prisoners were held in cell blocks specifically designed for the research program. The conditions were deliberately controlled, not in the sense of being humane, but in the scientific sense. Researchers needed baselines. They needed to know the health status of subjects before experiments began. Some prisoners were held for weeks or months before anything was done to them. Others were used almost immediately. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 were not random acts of cruelty. They were organized around specific military research questions. What is the minimum infectious dose of plague bacillus required to kill a human being? How long does a person survive frostbite before tissue becomes non-viable? And can that tissue be revived? At what atmospheric pressure does the human body cease to function? How does typhoid spread through a water supply, and at what concentration does it become reliably lethal? These were the questions. The prisoners were how Ishii's researchers answered them. Frostbite experiments were conducted outdoors in the Manchurian winter, where temperatures could reach -30 degrees Celsius. Prisoners had their limbs immersed in water and then exposed to freezing air until the flesh was destroyed. The researchers documented the progression, the color changes, the loss of sensation, the point at which the tissue was judged irreversibly damaged. Then they tested methods of rewarming, not to save the subjects, but to determine whether damaged soldiers in the field could be treated and returned to combat. Plague experiments involved direct injection of Yersinia pestis into prisoners, or exposure through flea vectors. The researchers tracked the disease progression, took samples, conducted vivisections, operations performed on living, conscious subjects, to examine internal organs without the interference of death or decay altering the tissue. The vivisections were not conducted with anesthesia, or were conducted with minimal amounts, because Ishii believed anesthetics contaminated the results. Several former Unit 731 researchers gave testimony after the war, describing these procedures in clinical detail, and there is nothing in their accounts that suggests they considered what they were doing to be unusual within the context in which they operated. That last point is worth sitting with. These were not men who had lost control of themselves. They were not in a frenzy, they were doing science in their understanding of the word. They wrote papers, they compared results, they argued about methodology. Dr. Hisato Yoshimura, who conducted the frostbite experiments, published research based on Unit 731 data after the war, in Japanese medical journals, under his own name, and faced no criminal charges. The research was used. That is how thoroughly the scientific community that received it had accepted the premise that the source of the data did not matter. The total number of people who died inside Unit 731 is not precisely known. The most widely cited estimates range from 3,000 to as many as 12,000 over the facility's roughly 13 years of operation. Those numbers deserve to be held carefully. 3,000 people is not an abstraction. It is a mid-sized town emptied. It is every person in a community gone, not from plague or famine, but from deliberate, methodical killing conducted in the name of research. And Unit 731 was not the only facility of its kind. Ishii's network included satellite units operating across occupied China. Unit 100 in Changchun, Unit 1644 in Nanjing, Unit 8604 in Guangzhou. The program that began with one man's pitch to the army had metastasized into a coordinated system of human experimentation spread across an entire theater of war. The question of what the Japanese High Command knew is, at this point, not seriously in dispute among historians. Sheldon Harris, whose 1994 work, Factories of Death, remains one of the most thorough examinations of the documentary record, concluded that the program operated with the knowledge and approval of the Army General Staff and the War Ministry. Prince Tsuneyoshi Takeda, a member of the imperial family, visited the facility. The emperor's personal physician had connections to the program. This was not a rogue operation that the Japanese government could later claim ignorance of. The institutions of the state looked at what was happening in Manchuria and continued to fund it. What that tells us about institutional behavior, about how bureaucracies process moral violations when those violations serve strategic purposes, is something the 20th century would demonstrate again and again in different countries, different contexts, different ideological frameworks. The mechanism is consistent even when the specifics change. You create a category of people who can be treated differently. You assign that category a name that is not quite human. You build administrative structures that normalize the processing of those people. You staff those structures with professionals who have been trained to think in terms of problems and solutions, and then you allow the logic of the problem to determine what counts as a solution. Ishii did not invent that mechanism. He inherited it, refined it, and applied it with unusual thoroughness. The scale of what Unit 731 achieved, if that word can be used, was a function not of one man's pathology, but of how completely the institutions around him had decided that the people inside that facility did not count. In the final weeks of the war, as Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria in August 1945, Ishii ordered the facility destroyed. The buildings were dynamited, documents were burned. The remaining prisoners, those who had somehow survived the experiments, were killed. Some were shot. Some were given lethal injections. Some were released and then killed by guards before they could reach the surrounding countryside. The crematorium had been running for years. In the last days, it ran continuously. Ishii and most of his senior staff fled to Japan. They arrived home before the Soviet capture of Harbin. They destroyed what records they could carry, and then they waited to see what the Americans would do. What the Americans did is one of the most consequential decisions in the post-war history of science and law, and it is still not fully absorbed into public understanding of that period. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation authority in Tokyo began receiving intelligence about Unit 731 almost immediately after the surrender. Former Japanese military officers, desperate to offer something valuable to their conquerors, began describing what had happened in Manchuria. The Soviets, who had captured some of the facility's local employees, were conducting their own investigations and would eventually try a dozen individuals in the Khabarovsk war crimes trial in 1949. The Americans knew that the Soviets knew. They also knew that the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal was proceeding, and that figures connected to Unit 731 had not been included in the indictments. The decision made by American occupation authorities, approved at levels that reached into Washington, was to grant Ishii and his senior researchers immunity from prosecution in exchange for their research data. The negotiation was conducted quietly between 1945 and 1948. Ishii's team provided technical reports. American biological weapons researchers at Fort Detrick reviewed the data and concluded it was, in the clinical language of their assessment, absolutely invaluable. It could not have been obtained, they argued, in any other way. That argument deserves examination. It is not obviously false, in the narrow sense. The experiments had produced data on human responses to infectious agents and extreme conditions that no ethical research program would ever generate. But the argument was not simply a scientific judgment. It was a moral choice dressed in scientific language. The researchers at Fort Detrick were deciding that the origin of the data did not place any obligation on how it was used or on what was owed to the people it had been extracted from. They were deciding, in effect, that the maruta were logs after all. Immunity was granted. No Unit 731 researcher was prosecuted by the United States or Japan. Ishii himself died in 1959 of throat cancer in his own home. Masaji Kitano, who commanded the unit after Ishii, became an executive at a major Japanese pharmaceutical company. Hisato Yoshimura, who froze people's limbs in Manchurian winters and then published the findings, spent his post-war career as a respected academic. The professional lives these men returned to were not lives lived in shadow. They were ordinary careers in medicine and science and business. The Soviet trial at Khabarovsk sentenced 12 defendants to labor camps ranging from 2 to 25 years. Most were released well before their sentences were completed. The United States at the time dismissed the Khabarovsk proceedings as communist propaganda, a characterization that served the immediate purpose of delegitimizing Soviet accusations, but also had the effect of suppressing public discussion of what Unit 731 had actually done. Inside Japan, the suppression was more thorough and lasted longer. Japanese textbooks largely omitted Unit 731 for decades. The site of the facility in Harbin became a museum only after China began pressing the historical record in the 1980s. It was not until 1994, nearly 50 years after the war ended, that a Japanese court acknowledged for the first time that Unit 731 had conducted lethal experiments on human beings. The acknowledgement came in a lawsuit brought by Chinese survivors and relatives of victims. The court acknowledged the facts and denied the claim for compensation. What does any of this reveal? So not about Japan specifically, or about the particular pathologies of imperial militarism, but about the structure of power itself when it decides that certain people's suffering is negotiable. Start with the most basic observation. The crimes of Unit 731 were not committed by people who thought of themselves as criminals. Ishii thought of himself as a patriot and a scientist. His researchers thought of themselves as professionals advancing a legitimate field. The American officials who granted immunity thought of themselves as pragmatists serving national security. The Japanese government officials who suppressed the history thought of themselves as protecting national stability. At every stage, the people making the decisions had frameworks that made the decisions feel, if not morally clean, then at least defensible within the logic they were operating inside. This is what power does when it is not constrained by anything external to itself. It does not require that its agents become monsters in their own self-conception. It requires only that they accept the premises, that some people are less than others, that strategic necessity overrides individual claims, that the past is manageable if the right information is controlled. People accept those premises all the time. Most of the time, the consequences are diffuse enough that no one has to look directly at what they have accepted. In Manchuria, the consequences were immediate and visible and recorded in clinical reports filed in triplicate. The immunity deal is where this becomes most instructive, because it illustrates something about how civilizations process atrocity. There is a period, immediately after a crime of this scale, when accountability is theoretically possible, when the perpetrators are identifiable, when the evidence exists, when the political will could in principle be marshaled. That window closes. It closes because of strategic interests, because of Cold War calculations, because of the ordinary human preference for moving forward rather than backward. And once it closes, the structure that made the atrocity possible is not actually dismantled. It is just left in place, unused for the moment, waiting. The use of human beings as experimental material did not end with Unit 731. The Tuskegee syphilis study, in which Black American men were deliberately left untreated for decades so researchers could observe the disease's progression, ran from 1932, the same year Ishii began his work in Manchuria, until 1972. The CIA's MKultra program conducted psychological experiments on unwitting subjects through the 1950s and 1960s. The populations selected for these programs were not random. They were people whose claims on the state's protection were, for one reason or another, treated as weaker than other people's claims. The mechanism that produced Unit 731 is not a historic curiosity, it is a tendency. That is not a comfortable thing to write, and it is not meant to flatten distinctions between what happened at Unit 731 and what happened elsewhere. The scale and deliberate brutality of the Harbin facility remains in a category that very little else occupies. But the tendency toward classifying some human beings as more available for harm than others, toward finding the administrative language that allows institutions to process that classification without confronting it directly. That tendency does not belong to Japan in the 1930s. It belongs to the species, which is why the forgetting matters as much as the remembering. Unit 731 was suppressed not because it was too horrifying to discuss, but because the suppression served interests. The Americans needed the data, the Japanese government needed stability. The scientific community needed to use the findings without relitigating their origins. Each of these choices was made by someone with a reason that felt sufficient at the time. The people who had been killed in Harbin had no institutional voice by 1946. They had been cremated. The facility had been demolished. The records had been burned. What remained were a few thousand pages of research findings, now classified inside American military archives, and the survivors of the surrounding region, whose testimony would take decades to be formally acknowledged as true. Memory is not a passive act. It requires choosing what to attend to, insisting on it, refusing the very normal pressure to move on. The survivors of Unit 731 and the families of those killed inside it pressed for acknowledgement for half a century before Japanese courts would even confirm that the events had occurred. That pressure, unrewarded, largely ignored by the countries most capable of acting on it, is itself a record of something. It is a record of what people do when the mechanisms of justice fail them, and the only thing left is the insistence that the truth be spoken. The logs were people. They had names. Most of those names are gone.